Welcome to the Hopkins Center. Take a moment to silence your cell phone. Also, please locate the nearest fire exit. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third session of our summer lecture series, Our Divided Country, How to Find Common Ground, and also welcome to the people watching on live streaming from the University of Vermont and Granite State. As you just heard, please check to make sure your cell phones or any other devices are in silent or turned off. Again, this week we will have a book signing during intermission in the same place as last week. That will be during the intermission. And hopefully, if there's still people in line when we have to come back for Q&A, she will be able to spend a few minutes after the session to sign the remaining. I want to draw your attention to two events next Tuesday. The first one is at 7 p.m. and is the second of our three films related to topics in our summer lecture series. This one is in El Séptimo Día, and will be right here in Spalding Auditorium, and Osher members pay only $5. Also next Tuesday at 4:30 is a special Osher lecture. This one is on the 1960s sit-in, and the speaker is Chris Schmidt, who is on the faculty of the Kent School of Law in Chicago, and is also the son of Meg and Jim Schmidt, who are Osher members. That is free and open to the public. So at this point, I'd like to thank our underwriters and sponsors, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Dartmouth Coach, Kendall at Hanover, Wells Fargo Advisors, and this week's sponsor, Tyler Sims. And now I'd like to introduce today's session moderator, John Ferries, who will introduce our speaker. John?
Thank you. All of you who've received your program or mailers know that Kathy Edin attended and got her BA degree from North Park College in Chicago, and her master's, and then her PhD degree in sociology and public policy from Northwestern. You probably also noticed that she has been a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. In fact, she was chair of the Department of Inequality and Social Policy at the Kennedy Center. And in 2014, she became faculty director of the department at Johns Hopkins. She and her husband, Tim, now are professors of sociology at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. That's what you probably know. But what's really interesting about Kathy, as we thought about a speaker for the subject of inequality, is that she's one of the people who has really walked the talk. She isn't just looking at numbers and sort of doing some research. She's really concerned about these people to the extent that she's living amongst them. She's wanting a very diverse environment for her own family. She's extremely, extremely interested in being a part, and most importantly, a voice of the people in the inequality. She has two books that she'll be signing today. One is $2 a Day, The Art of Living on Virtually Nothing in America. The New York Times called that book a powerful book that presents a deeply moving human face to the stunning inequality numbers in America, an explosive book. Her other book, Coming of Age in the Other America, the Washington Post praised for featuring the plight of those who are born, those kids born into low-income families who have enormous difficulty entering the middle class and achieving the American dream. She has also been given testimony to Congress. She's written numerous op-ed articles. Among the titles of some of these, The Rise of Extreme Poverty in the United States, Want to Do Something About Income Inequality, explaining exploitative slumlord behavior, and claiming fatherhood, race, and the dynamics of unmarried men. So she has really walked the talk, and it's a privilege and for me an honor to welcome to our session today our speaker, Kathy Edin.
Thank you, John. So, first of all, I'd like to thank my hosts, John and Donna. You've just been so marvelous, and we had dinner with a few of you last night at the Ferguson's home. Beautiful home, quite a ways down the road, and so I am aware of what a serious and amazing group of people you are. And I'm going to take you seriously and give you the best I've got. We're going to discuss numbers. We're going to talk about stories. But what I'm going to talk about is not something that you would find if you Googled inequality or even poverty. And it's really the story underneath the story of what's happened with poverty over the last 20 years in the United States. Anytime you read something in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal about poverty, stop and say to yourself, who among the poor are they talking about? Because the story I'm going to tell you today is about widening inequality, not just in society. We all know that, right? Economists like Thomas Piketty, Angus Deaton, and Case have told us that story. But I'm going to tell you a story of widening inequality among the poor. And I'm going to try to convince you that you should be very, very worried about what's happening in the bottom 20% of society as social policy and changes in the family and the economy have really led to a bifurcation of life chances, especially of children among the poor. Now, I'm an ethnographer, but I also am a demographer. And I spent my early career, my 20s, touring the country, interviewing hundreds of low-income single mothers about how they made ends meet. And I did this work prior to the nation's landmark welfare reform legislation of 1996. And because of that, I sort of have a tick in my personality. I'm always, I'm a human calculator. You spend 10 years asking people about their budgets, and you begin wondering all the time about their budgets. Last night at dinner, I wanted to ask everyone how they made ends meet, but I resisted. But that's a backdrop to the story that I'm going to tell now. So I'd written this book on how you really couldn't survive on welfare or low-wage work either prior to welfare reform, and I'd gone on to write a couple books about the family and some work on public housing. But it wasn't until 2010 that I came to Baltimore. I was at the Harvard Kennedy School at the time. I came to Baltimore to follow up on a cohort of young people we had started interviewing when they were babies in some of the nation's most notorious high-rise public housing. So if you've seen The Wire on HBO, our kids were born in those projects. And we had followed them now until their early 20s, and we were coming back to Baltimore, which was our site, to figure out find out how they turned out. And so one summer day, I had as an assignment to interview Ashley. We hadn't talked to Ashley for a couple of years, but we did know she was 19. We knew she had a baby, a newborn, and we had her address. And so we walked up to her home. She lived in the Latrobe Homes along Madison Avenue, very economically depressed area of central Baltimore, actually tucked right in the shadow of the Baltimore prison, and knocked on the door. And Ashley opens the door. And I've been doing this for a long time. By that point, I had talked to hundreds of, maybe even thousands of low-income families. And you sort of get an instinct after a while when something is wrong. So the first thing I noticed is that Ashley was not making eye contact. She was also visibly unkempt. But maybe most worrying, she was passing this 2-week-old infant from shoulder to shoulder. The baby was fussing. But she was failing to do the one thing all parents know to do, right? Put that hand behind the baby's head. So I was worried. I was worried about Ashley, and we followed her up the steep steps to the second floor where the apartment was, and there was virtually no furniture in the house. There was a trash pick couch. There was a single mattress on the floor with a torn, fitted Bugs Bunny sheet. There was a table with only 3 legs, so it was useless. It was pushed up against the wall, and just one chair. So, one of the rules of the work I do is we never want to be higher than our respondents. So I always try to sit lower. I always try to put them in the seat of authority. They're the teachers, I'm the learner. So I sat on the floor, and Ashley sat in the chair with the baby. And it just so happened that this position gave me the perfect vantage point to observe the kitchen. Now, in this particular public housing unit, the cupboards had all come off of, the doors had come off of the cupboards. And the first thing I noticed is, of course, there's nothing in these cupboards. And so I'm supposed to be actually interviewing Ashley on the transition to adulthood. This is the project I'd come to finish, and indeed it is the subject of the book Coming of Age in the Other America, one of the 2 books that you'll have an opportunity for me to sign later on today. But I reverted to my 20s and began asking Ashley how she made ends meet. Now, this is 15 years after welfare reform, right? Everybody had sort of judged welfare reform a success. But I was absolutely stunned to learn that although this family had a housing subsidy, there was no income, no cash income coming into this household. It was Ashley, her baby, her mother, a young cousin. Nothing from work, nothing from cash assistance, nothing from Social Security, nothing from unemployment insurance. At that point, nothing from food stamps or SNAP either, although the family would soon get something from SNAP because of the baby. So you never know when you're going to have an epiphany, and a thought occurred to me, could it be, in the world's most advanced capitalist society, that a new kind of poverty, a poverty maybe so deep we didn't even think it existed, had sprung up right under our noses? Now, the second epiphany happened the next day. I was worried about Ashley and the baby, and so at the end of our conversation together, I said, Ashley, I'd love to come back tomorrow. We pay $50 per interview. I said, I can pay you another $50. I have a few more questions to ask you. Can I come back? And she said, yes. So I handed her the $50 in cash, the only cash in the household, right? And I went away and came back the next day. And you can imagine my shock when Ashley was, as we were approaching her apartment, she was leaving out the door. She had gone down to the Goodwill at the bottom of Broadway Avenue in Fells Point and purchased a pantsuit. She was wearing the pantsuit. She had gone and gotten a home perm. She looked terrific. There was literally a spring in her step as she announced to us that she was off to look for a job, having deposited the baby with her mother. $50? I could not believe the change in this woman. $50, and so the second thought that occurred to me, and again, these are hypotheses at this point, right, is could it be that in the world's most advanced capitalist society, where we don't have barter like they do in the rest of the world, we don't have much barter, that there was something essential about cash as a resource? Not food stamps, not a housing subsidy, but cash, that made the difference between Ashley, the Ashley who was too despondent to properly care for her child, and the Ashley who, with a spring in her step, was out ready to better herself by finding a job. So I kind of tucked these insights into my back pocket and finished the study of the transition to adulthood that I was supposed to be in Baltimore doing. Fascinating story in and of itself, although I'm not going to talk about it today. And it wasn't until I was back at Harvard in my office at the Kennedy School that Luke Schaefer, my co-author, he's a data guy. He's like the data guy. Showed up. At this point, he was a visiting professor he was a assistant professor at Michigan, and somehow I had agreed to sponsor him as a visiting professor at Harvard. I'd forgotten he was coming. He shows up in my office, 8 a.m. Monday morning. I'm scrambling to remember who is this guy and what am I supposed to do. But I remembered one thing about Luke, who's now like a superstar, right? But this was back in the day. I remembered that he was the nation's expert on the one government data source that captured more of the income of the poor than any other data source. It's a kind of an obscure study called the Survey of Income and Program Participation. It's run by the Census Bureau, but it has the most detailed income data that we as a country collect. And I knew it was only by analyzing this data source that I would know whether Ashley's story was just an N of one, a blip, and that can happen, right? Or whether it was a trend. So I told him the story of Ashley. He got very excited. He said, you know, I've got almost the right algorithm already on my computer, or whatever it is that data people talk about, algorithms. And I'll be back. So I like to say he came back the next day, but you know, data people like to pretend that their work is harder than ours. So he says he came back a week later, but both of us were stunned by what he had found. In the last 20 years, at any given time, according to the SIP, the number of families with children in America experiencing virtually zero cash income. We chose $2 per person per day because you have to choose something, and this is, of course, one of the World Bank's thresholds for developing nations. The number of kids living in virtually cashless households increased from about 1.7% to 4.3% of all U.S. children. Okay? So about a quarter of all poor children were living virtually cashless lives. Yes, when we factor in SNAP, that's food stamps, and we pretend that it's cash, it reduces the number. You only see roughly a 50% doubling, but nonetheless, the trend is going in the same way, and those secondary lines are only less dramatic because they're pitted against this very dramatic first line. Now, we wanted to go beyond this point-in-time figure because we know incomes fluctuate a lot. So we then put ourselves to a more difficult test. We followed children in the Survey of Income and Program Participation over an entire year and asked how many of these kids experienced at least 7 months in a household with virtually no cash income. Again, you see this dramatic rise. Because we are sticklers would be one way of putting it, neurotic would be another way of putting it. We then went to every other data source available in the United States to see if we could document these trends. This is the American Community Survey, the red bars, which is, of course, the long form of our census. And then the blue bars are the current population surveys. From these data sources, we can only assess whether a child has been in extreme poverty for an entire year. Okay, so this is looking over an entire year, not a point in time, not a 7-month window. And again, we see this very dramatic rise in extreme poverty. How many are data junkies out there? Any former government bureaucrats? Okay, you might have heard that sometimes people underreport their income to surveys. So the Edin Institute has come up with this amazing tool called TRIM, which imputes unreported income. So we really wanted to put this to the test, right? So we said, let's go and see, let's put this to the most stringent test possible. And what's really interesting about this chart is our detractors, shall we say, were like, when Edin and Schaefer do TRIM, it's going to wipe out their findings. Well, instead of a rough doubling of extreme poverty over 20 years, what we see here is all families with children, we see a quadrupling. And I can talk in Q&A about why that might be. When we limit our focus to single mothers with children, who are the most vulnerable of our families in America, the increase, wait for it, sevenfold. Sevenfold. So you may say to yourself, I actually don't believe surveys. Anyone skeptical of surveys? I like you people. All right, we won't talk about who's skeptical of surveys, but you might say to yourself, gee, we should go to administrative sources because they're not subject to underreporting or to survey response bias. This is data from the SNAP program. If you lie to SNAP about your income, first of all, they check with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Second, if you lie, it is a felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. In fact, I'm going to tell you a story of child molestation in a little bit. And if you got convicted of that charge, you could go to jail for less time than from committing food stamp fraud. And it's right there in the application. And here we see plotted the number of families with children reporting zero income to the food stamp program, either at recertification or at time of application. And you can see just the dramatic growth. The blue diamonds there are our own estimates from the SIP. And what we can see here is a divergence at the end of the series. Can anyone guess what that might be? Why might the SNAP program be registering more people without any money than this household survey, the SIP? Homeless, exactly. And I'm going to show you that homelessness has indeed, especially among children, has indeed increased during this period, and household surveys aren't capturing it. So the trends I'm reporting to you are biased downward by the fact that we're missing all these homeless families from our household surveys, or many of them. And one more piece of administrative data, I'm going to show you more of these throughout the talk, is from our nation's food pantries. And again, we see the same very dramatic trend. Now, does income matter? We have Medicaid. In some states, we have Medicaid expansion. Virtually all poor children are covered by Medicaid. The SNAP program covers virtually all poor children. The take-up is about 8 in 10. Does income matter, even though we have these other means-tested non-cash benefits for the poor, which I wouldn't argue with for a second. The answer is yes. So this is hot off the press work by Luke Schaefer and his colleagues showing the monotonic relationship, really the overwhelming correlation between the amount of income you have and the amount of hardship that you're going to face. And people who are very, very poor, people who are within that category of the poor, so we can maybe draw a line right here. These are the poor. Within that group, people who are extremely poor are measurably worse off than people who are just plain poor. So John sold me as a person who gets out and talks to people, and I've just shown you a bunch of charts. Like you, we said, gee, all of these data maybe raise more questions than answers. And so we put ourselves to a test. We said, can we just move to 4 places in the United States where we actually don't have a lot of contacts? Can we spend a couple of months? This is my part of the study. I did this, and Luke came and visited from time to time. Could I just show up in Chicago, in Cleveland, in Appalachia, and in the Mississippi Delta for a couple months? Could I actually find people who were not just in the statistics, but really living this out in their daily lives? And could I then follow them for many months and years to answer the following questions? How did this happen in the first place? What led to this spiral into extreme poverty? Could we develop some hypotheses about what this might mean for our nation, that we have this new group of poor living an experience of poverty perhaps so deep that we didn't even know it existed? And, what did they do to survive? Because you probably can't actually live without cash in the world's most advanced capitalist society. So we did this and identified 18 families and followed them for many months and years. I've just been in Tennessee and the Mississippi Delta catching up with some of these families. And from those data, we developed 3 hypotheses. First, the virtual death, the shredding of the cash safety net in America has no doubt played a considerable role. Second, the housing crisis. And third, the nature of work. The nature of work. So we're going to start with the first. We provocatively titled one of our chapters, Welfare is Dead. And actually, we did not choose that title because of the numbers I'm about to show you. Okay, but let's start with the numbers. So this was our cash welfare system in the nation on the eve of welfare reform. About 15 million people were on the program, 10 million kids, 5 million adults. 2/3 of poor families with children were touched by our cash safety net during that time. So what do you think our cash safety net looks like today? Now, I'm using the most liberal statistics possible. I'm counting not only the federal TANF program, but all state programs as well. So I could tell you a much more dire version of this story, but I'm not going to. What we can see is we have only about 2.5 million children left on the rolls, only about 1 million adults. Half of these adults are in just 2 states, California and New York, meaning that across the rest of our 48 states, we have only 500,000 adults on the rolls. And only about 23%, that figure may be down now to 20% of families are being touched by our cash welfare system over the course of a year. Here are those numbers in different form. So this is the national average. This is called the TANF to poverty ratios, how many poor families are touched by our cash welfare system over time. These are the figures for New Hampshire. So in New Hampshire in 1996, just prior to welfare reform, every poor household with children was touched at some point during the year by the cash welfare system. That's down to about 1/4. You mimic the nation. Your average, I believe New Hampshire is above average. I'm from Minnesota, so of course I believe that. But you're about average. And I'm going to show you the potential cost to your state of being just average. Your neighbor, Vermont, does about twice as well as you. It is one of the 4 standout states that's managed to maintain some semblance of a cash safety net, but it's a shadow of its former self nonetheless. Now you may say, well, the rules have just changed. Maybe fewer people are eligible. Here are national estimates done by HHS of the number of people who remain eligible, who simply aren't getting benefits. And we can see only about 30% of eligibles by 2013 were getting benefits. That figure is probably lower now. And there's a distinct state pattern. I would point out the difference between New Hampshire and Vermont there. So keep that in mind. But really where we see TANF completely falling apart is in the Deep South, Appalachia, and some of our mountain states. I believe in Wyoming, the TANF director just told me there were 300 families on the welfare rolls in the whole state. In many states, the TANF to poverty ratio is under 10. Now, what might this mean for a state like Vermont? This map, so pretend this is the United States. You've got the rough shape of the United States here, is the number of children the percentage of children in SNAP households with no cash, with parents who have no earnings, no source of cash in the household. And in Vermont, where they've kept up a semblance of the welfare system, that figure is 1.6%. In New Hampshire, it's over 10%. Over 10% of your children on SNAP are living in households with no cash. Now, you might that's according to the SNAP program, the best source probably possible because it is administrative data and not survey data. But you can comfort yourself that you're not as bad as Tennessee, where almost 1 in 5 children are living in cashless households. So I might have mentioned that we didn't label the title welfare is dead because of these numbers. We did so because when we went out in communities, we were astonished that people simply didn't know about the program. And when hardship hit, it didn't come to mind. I stood with Madonna Harris in myriad soup kitchen lines. She and her daughter Brianna were living across a series of homeless shelters when I began following them in Chicago in the summer of 2012. And they were living in a homeless shelter. They had no food over the weekend. And I said to Madonna, why don't you just go apply for TANF? You know, I used the state-specific name. And she looked at me like I was crazy. And she said, girl, they aren't giving that out anymore. Similarly, when I was in Johnson, Tennessee with Travis and Jessica Compton, we were literally waiting at the window for the sheriff's deputy to come and evict the family. Their hours had been reduced to 0 over the last 3 months because of the slowdown of tourist traffic in that mountain state. You here know about this ebb and flow, and of course the low-wage workers really are the ones that bear the brunt of these seasonal shifts. So they're about to be evicted. I'm sitting with Jessica on the bed in the only room in the house where the whole family sleeps. Travis is standing at the window, and Luke sort of standing alongside Travis, and finally breaks down and asks, why don't you just go apply for welfare? And Travis looks at Luke, shocked, and says, what's that? Ray McCormick in Cleveland does know about TANF. She refuses to apply because she thinks it would be an offense to her Father in heaven, who believed strongly in self-sufficiency and died when she was 12. But she'd got this beautiful little daughter, Aniva, who was a hungry kid, right? They were living in a shack with no plumbing. They were stealing electricity from the neighbor next door. They only had one outlet. It was terrible conditions. And she was finally convinced to go apply for TANF, and we were all like waiting at the house for her to come back, and she said, oh, they told me there were too many needy people, and I should come back next year. There wasn't enough to go around. So at this period of time in the state of Ohio, the state, by our research, was sitting on $1 million TANF surplus, an unspent surplus of $1 million. We then gave Ray a journal. She applied to TANF 3 more times and was turned down, illegally, by the way, every time. So this is leg 1 of this 3-legged stool of hypotheses that we developed. The second relates to work. And I know many of you are former employers, so you might find this particularly interesting. But the rhetoric around poverty has been that there are sort of 2 groups of poor people, the generational poor and the working poor. So I was recently asked to go speak at a prominent California Foundation board meeting. And I won't name the board, I'm so tempted, but the board chair said to me, you know, we don't really want you to talk about that $2 a day stuff because we're only interested in the working poor, not the generational poor. And I said, oh, then I will be talking about $2 a day. Now, why do I say that? So again, we're going to go back to the SIP, and we're going to follow children over the course of a year, and we're going to look at how many children have an adult in their household who works for at least 1 month in the formal labor market. And we're going to compare that to how many of these children have an adult who gets even a penny from welfare. And we've got sort of the just plain poor, all of the poor in the first set of bars, and the $2 a day poor in the second set of bars. And what we can see is that the penetration of TANF is astonishingly low. Astonishingly low. But look at the penetration of work. Look at the penetration of work. Work is embedded in the imaginations, in the aspirations, and the hopes and dreams of so many of our poor families, even our desperately poor. One thing welfare reform might have accomplished is a deeper sense among women that work was part and central to their identities. And we hear this again and again in the field. But what we find is that despite considerable work effort, despite the fact that people see themselves as workers and take pride in that identity, right? Work is literally at the edges, at the low margins, so fragile it's literally disintegrating in their fingers. So there's a plethora of research showing that the bad jobs of 20 years ago were just much, much better than the bad jobs of today. In particular, unsafe work conditions are common. Not enough hours, ubiquitous. Involuntary part-time employment, a huge and growing problem in our economy. Never knowing how many hours you're going to get. If you have a teenager working for Walgreens or CVS, you know this. Parents experience this too. Labor law violations, one especially common one happens to hotel room attendants. And many times they're asked to clock in only after they've cleaned a room, or they're made to clean a room after they've clocked out. Of course, this is illegal, but it happens all the time. One story from $2 a day concerns Jennifer Hernandez. She was raising her children, Caitlin and Cole, on the south side of Chicago, again moving through a series of homeless shelters. The shelter she was in is amazing. They had a program that if you could get a job in 3 months, they would give you a subsidy for a year for a market rate apartment, at which time you were supposed to have become self-sufficient. Okay, we'll leave that aside, but she had a chance to get this voucher. And so literally on the very last day of first day, despite pounding the pavement, Jennifer has a pair of glasses from Medicaid that are broken, right? And she's got seriously corroded teeth and gums. We hired a professional social worker for 3 months, and the social worker could find no source of free dental care for an adult in the city of Chicago. Right, so you can see why she might not have been your first hire, but a sweet, generous, hardworking person. So she finally finds this job at Chicago City Custodial Services. And of course, these are jobs that are out of the public eye. She starts out working full-time, which is just a gift in this economy, a little bit above $8 an hour. Again, a gift. And she's cleaning apartment buildings between tenants, corporate apartments downtown, and she loves this job. The sense that she's made a difference, that she can actually see. But as winter comes on, Chicago City loses these contracts. And the only contracts it can get are to clean foreclosed homes in the city of Chicago. So she and her crew, imagine this, put hot water in big buckets in the back of their van, and they drive down to these foreclosed homes. And of course, foreclosed homes lack a couple of critical things: heat, power, right? Many of these have been boarded up, and you never know what you're going to find. In her words, it could be wild animals or a drug den. Often the places were riddled with mold and other toxins, and Jennifer, of course, was a severe asthmatic. And as the winter got more and more intense, Jennifer began to get sicker and sicker and sicker, and her two children, who also had asthma, began to also get swept up into the cycle of illness. And so she would show up at work. Her boss would say, "You're too sick to work. I'm going to send you home. You're going to get the rest of the crew sick." But then began to punish her for being unreliable and reduced her hours from 40 to 30 to 20 to just 10. So Jennifer said to herself, I've only got a few months of this housing subsidy left before I'm supposed to be self-sufficient. It took me 3 months to find this job. And so she had to quit that job to look for another. And as I'll show you in a minute, she never did achieve that goal. One other story in this regard about work is friends and family can be supportive, but they can also be the cause of inability to keep a job. Ray McCormick lived with a cast of characters in Cleveland, sort of a fictive aunt and uncle who basically ran an illegal rooming house. They found vulnerable people on SSI. in Social Security, and in exchange for their benefits, they gave them very minimal accommodations in abandoned buildings, if you can believe that. She's living with this sort of ragtag cast of characters. She is paying all of her income for rent and the rental of a truck to get her back and forth to Walmart. She's actually been such a successful Walmart employee. She's won the Employee of the Month award twice in the last 6 months. But when George and Camilla drive up all the gas in that truck, unbeknownst to her, and she turns on the car on a Monday morning and the empty signal registers, she goes to her manager, she calls her manager, can someone float the 2-time cashier of the month alone or give them a ride? She's told, if you can't find a way to get to work, don't bother coming in. Don't bother coming in anymore. And you can understand that manager's point of view. There's a new book out by Adam Reich and Peter Behrman that shows that when a Walmart opens, there are oftentimes more applicants than there are applicants per job, than there are applicants per spot at Harvard University. It is amazing. So perilous work. The third leg is housing instability. Housing instability is virtually a hallmark of life among the $2 a day poor. Of course, you don't have enough money for housing unless you have a subsidy. And if you have a subsidy, of course, when your income falls to zero, your rent also falls to zero. Now, you would imagine the best thing that you could do is fall into the arms of your family, but it turns out that often among the $2 a day poor, this is the dynamic that leads to sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, in part because families are engaging not in stable double-ups with parents, but often repeated perilous double-ups with kin, friends and family, folks they don't know very well. Jennifer Hernandez's daughter, Caitlin, is molested by Uncle Jose. He's the man they flee to after Jennifer can't find a job, and the only person willing to take her in is an uncle in South Texas. Very traumatic story of what happens to this family in $2 a day in the aftermath of that episode. Ray McCormick has lived in $2 a day poverty since her father died when she was 12. In fact, for a while she was living on her own as a 12-year-old in Cleveland. Her mother fled the scene for a lover in the Appalachian Mountains after her father died. She had only her father's Social Security death benefits to support her and the company of her pit bull, Sweetie. That really was his name. And when we asked her about her housing situations and the risks they led to, she shrugged and said, "Oh yeah, I've been beat, I've been raped." So I told you I'd show you data about homelessness among youth. These are homeless numbers provided by our nation's schools. So this is, again, administrative data, the most reliable data we can get. Schools were not totally compliant. We've got any teachers or administrators in here at reporting this McKinney-Vento data until the line that I've drawn there. The blip prior to that line is Hurricane Katrina. But we can see this monotonic rise in the number of students reported being homeless by their schools. And we've done a very careful state-by-year fixed effects research to show that this is directly related to the shredding of the cash safety net that I reported. In fact, for every 100 case decline in the rolls in a state, there are 14 more homeless students as reported by their schools. This is a huge relationship. We also know from research by Hope Harvey, one of my graduate students, that if you end up in one of these situations, your odds of graduating high school, going to college, being recorded as obese, all dramatically affected by the experience of being homeless. And these data from New York show that virtually every negative outcome associated with schooling is profoundly influenced by whether or not you've had to double up. or you're reported homeless. So you might be asking yourself, well, how do these families survive? I'm actually not going to tell you very much, because I want you to read the book, and I want you to give the book to other people. But you might say to yourself, what about the role of private charity? Many of you probably volunteer for charities. Keep going, vital work. But it turns out that the richest places have the richest charitable sectors. So private charity actually exacerbates rather than relieves poverty in places like the Mississippi Delta, where I just spent the last week. There is virtually no charitable sector to speak of. Second, the most fungible resource these families have is SNAP. And some people say, well, Edin and Schaefer should have included SNAP as cash in their estimates. And all of our estimates do include a line if you did include SNAP. But this is why we don't do so. It is not common. Food stamp fraud is not common in the United States. Only about 1.4% of the caseload is found to be fraudulent. And that's way down from prior years. But among the $2 a day poor, according to our ethnographic work, it's ubiquitous. And why is this? Well, it turns out that SNAP can't buy your kids socks and underwear. SNAP can't pay the rent. Right? SNAP can't pay your utilities, or buy your kids' school supplies, or get you feminine products at the grocery store, or buy you toilet paper, or any of those things. Neither can a Medicaid card. And I'm going to show you some examples that suggest that having no income literally makes you sick. So is it valuable to give someone a Medicaid card when you've already made them sick? Is this an efficient way to go? Perhaps not. But in any case, this is ubiquitous, and we're going to see at the end a little story about what this does to a family. What if you have to sell your SNAP for cash? And often you only get 50 to 60 cents on the dollar. What does that do to your food security? Because the food stamp program assumes you're buying a third of your food, so they're only providing 2/3 of your food. Surveys show that most families run out of food stamps 3 weeks into the month. So what does this do to a family? And I'll end with that story. There's a lot of ingenuity, sort of old-fashioned ingenuity in these stories, particularly among our older folks. Paul Heckwalder in Cleveland had no end of creative strategies for combating $2 a day poverty when the family pizza business failed, and he had 24 members of his household. 4 pizza stores closed, ended up getting evicted and all living in his household. One of his innovative strategies was to take the gutter apart and rig it up over the garbage can and then use that rainwater to flush the toilets. He also had a scheme to reuse the wash water in the laundry. Last time I saw Paul, he was so terrified of not having water again that he had dug a 50-foot well in his basement, bona fide well. I mean, nicely done. He's a skilled guy. It's funny, he had a victory garden in his backyard. He called it a victory garden. He planted spoiled food from the food pantry. And he had quite nice zucchinis and other vegetables. And I remember his granddaughter talking to her about when they all lived in this spell of $2 a day poverty. And she said, oh man, it was like pioneer days. And then she told me how she and her brothers would sit up in their grandfather's bedroom with a BB gun and shoot away the rats as they came around these vegetables. Quite a childhood. Jessica Compton gave blood, gave plasma twice weekly. She was a woman who weighed only 111 pounds, just 1 pound over the limit. She found it physically debilitating. It was literally the only source of cash income in her household. Plasma sales were ubiquitous among our families. In fact, virtually all families had that little divot, right, in their arms from frequent plasma donations. Here's an example of a plasma center. You've probably seen them. This one is in Cleveland. This is the one that Ray McCormick, Paul Heckwalder, used when they donated plasma. We recently had a film crew out filming people as they got off the bus. There's a bus stop right by that building where the red car is. I used to take people to that bus stop, and I'd say, wait here. We're going to see 35 people get off that bus, and they're all going to go into that plasma center. Never failed. This was like if you came to visit me in Cleveland, this was our entertainment. We'd go here. But this was a winter day when the film crew was there, and there was a woman waiting in line in a blizzard with no shoes. And this is the increase in plasma donations over the last 15 years or so. It's a huge multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's really being run on the backs of the extreme poor. These are plasma centers across the United States, and the best predictor of where a plasma center will locate is if the census tract has a high proportion not just of poor people, but of deeply poor people. And so you see the clustering in the upper Midwest, the Rust Belt cities, and especially in Appalachia, the Deep South, and the Delta. So speaking of the Delta, I had the great privilege of spending the last 4 years in and out of the poorest place in America. Anyone been to Clarksdale, Cleveland lately? There's nothing there. There's a reason you're not going down there. A little bit of good blues. But the towns look literally like they've been eaten by rodents. Right? It's an incredibly poor area. And in fact, you could probably throw a stone in any direction in many of these little towns like Percy that we studied down in the Delta and hit somebody living in $2 a day poverty. Strikingly, in going back down to the Delta last week, none of the families that we interviewed 4 years ago, we began interviewing 4 years ago, had escaped this condition. But we met a family there, Alva Mae Hicks. Alva had 13 children, which many Delta families do, right? It's kind of a holdover of the old sharecropper tradition. And she was just one generation off picking cotton herself. She had these 13 kids. They were living in a 2-bedroom apartment. There were 7 kids on the bed, like little Lincoln logs, and 8 kids on this trash-picked rug in the front room. I was just there the other day and actually saw this sleeping pattern live. And in order to pay her utilities, she had virtually no cash income. In order to pay her utilities, she sold her SNAP. She sold $600 of her SNAP benefits to pay a $300 utility bill in a climate that ranged in the prior 6 months to when we interviewed her between 9 degrees and 109 degrees. You know, and even so, they're keeping these utility bills as low as possible. With going into the household, it's really interesting. This is very common, especially in the South, but also where I live in Baltimore, they have black sheets over all the windows so as to keep out the heat. Now, they're keeping that utility bill as low as possible, but they're literally living in the dark. So anyway, her daughter, Tabitha, becomes a major character in our book. She and her brothers, as a consequence of her mother selling half of her food stamps to pay the utilities, usually get about a week of food. And then they are hungry. And I mean, these kids are so hungry. They're emaciated, rail thin. And so Tabitha, you know, her entire childhood, from when her father left the family when she was just a young kid, all the way to the present, has just experienced these extensive periods without food. So, you know, she tells this really harrowing story of how in junior high she just was so hungry and teachers are starting to notice it. And one teacher inboxed her on Facebook, and he said in his post, "I've been watching you since you were young, waiting for you to mature." He then invited her to come over to his house after school and offered her food in exchange for sex. to this day, this pains her more than any other thing in her very, very traumatic biography, which you can read about in $2 a day. You know, it was the teacher, the violation of trust that represented. She stayed in this relationship for about 5 months, smuggling food in her backpack back to her very hungry younger brothers. And she finally, desperate and deeply ashamed, she told her teacher, Mr. Patton. And in sort of a miraculous intervention, he not only gets her out of the situation, but gets her into a boarding school in Memphis, where she graduates. So this was a very hard story for Tabitha to tell. She told it over many, many meetings. But when I finally got the courage to ask her about what it felt to be that hungry, we were sitting outside of Yazoo Pass, which is one of the only places you can actually get breakfast or a cup of coffee in Clarksdale, Mississippi. It's the old Woolworths. It's the Woolworths who closed down its lunch counter in 1964 rather than integrate. And I asked her, you know, Tabitha, what does it feel like to be that hungry? And she told me, well, actually, it feels like you want to be dead because it's peaceful being dead. So is it fair to apply the standard $2 a day, a standard that has been used in the developing world, to the U.S.? Perhaps not. We have food stamps. For about a quarter of eligible families, we have housing subsidies. We have Medicaid for most poor children and some of their parents. But nonetheless, look at some of our health statistics. This is work you can find on our website, $2adaday.com. We find that some disadvantaged American groups have life expectancies that parallel that of folks in Lebanon. Other groups show life expectancy that rivals that in Mongolia, and African Americans face an infant mortality rate comparable to Tonga and Grenada. These are not our peer nations. These are not our peer nations. Many of our most vulnerable citizens are poor. In Baltimore, for example, just across the city itself, the life expectancy rates across our neighborhoods differ by 15 years. If you go out into the county, that difference is 20 years. You may have heard from our nation's leader that poverty has been solved in the United States. I want to read you a quote by my colleague, Luke Schaefer, from a recent paper he published. As a bit of a rebuttal to that, he says, "We live in America where eviction is a common experience, where the poor sell their blood plasma just to scrape by, fueling a multi-billion-dollar industry, where infant mortality among the vulnerable ranks is with much poorer nations, where we incarcerate those at the bottom at rates unprecedented in human history, and where life expectancy is well below much more poor countries, and falling." Yes, life expectancy in the United States is falling for the first time in our history. We can argue about causes and consequences of poverty and what to do about it. But can anyone really argue that we've solved it? So what do we do going forward? In the book, and for the book, we, at the nation's capital, we gathered about 20 policymakers and representatives of leading nonprofits in the United States, Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services, United Way, President's Chief Domestic Policy Advisor, Luke Tate, gave us an entire day. This is Obama's policy advisor. And we sat down with these stories, and together we crafted 14 policy solutions, maybe both big think and highly tractable, to address $2 a day. We end up endorsing 3 principles, and I think many different policy solutions, maybe both right-leaning and left-leaning, could derive from these principles. First of all, if we're going to have a work-based safety net, if we're going to not help people who don't work, we need to make sure that everyone who wants a job can get one. Right? In Percy, Mississippi, you got to have $25 to pay a gypsy cab just to get to Cleveland to work at the Walmart. There are no buses. Second, we find strong evidence that when children experience adverse life experiences, these are these instances of trauma in childhood that tend to cast a long shadow over the whole life course. It is often in the context of these repeated perilous double-ups. And doubling up seems to have very long-term consequences for children in ways that our whole society should worry about, because they lead to less educated and productive workers, less stable parents, and so on. So we need to figure out what to do with the affordable housing crisis. In recent years, rents have increased by about 6%, but renters' income has fallen by 13%. So there is now an unprecedented divide between what people can afford and what landlords need to charge just to stay in business. But third, work is not always going to work. There are always going to be some circumstances, a high-risk pregnancy, an elderly family member, a child who is chronically ill, where families are going to need a little bit of a hand up and something to stabilize them as they get through a rough patch. So we do advocate that we need to think of some way to ensure families, whether it be through, I don't think there's any political will for reviving cash welfare in the United States, but you could imagine other schemes to ensure families against these kinds of risks, so they don't have to enter into this spiral that leads to the poverty traps we're observing as we follow these families now 3 years beyond the publication of the book and see virtually no progress, except in one instance. If you read about Mrs. Potts, she has 3 kids in college. But beyond these policy solutions, what our families wanted more than anything else really surprised us. So we usually end our series of interviews with families saying, well, so what was it like being in this study? And almost to a person, folks said something that really surprised me. They said something like this: if my suffering can help even one person, it will have been worth it. So telling my story can help even one person, it will be worth it. And as we begin to probe that response, what came out is people's desire to contribute and to be valued by their communities for what they could bring. Now, if you survey both public and private charity across the United States, we often ignore the fact that people want to belong and to be valued and to be treated as if they themselves have something to contribute. And oftentimes in our effort to help, we actually end up shaming or treating people as if they have nothing to contribute. So we conclude the book by endorsing a litmus test for any reform going forward. Is it going to integrate the poor into our communities? I mean, that's the hard work, right? Helping, charity is one thing. By the way, poor people don't like it. We don't like it. No one in America seems to like charity, but poor people feel shamed, by charity. Is there a way to give a hand up in a way that's meaningful and inclusionary and respectful and even loving? Are we integrating the poor, or are we inadvertently isolating the poor? What folks say about going to the welfare office is, they treat you like dirt in the street. It's almost like you have to trade your citizenship card in to collect those few dollars from the welfare system. If you have no money and 2 kids in the state of Vermont or the state of New Hampshire, the maximum benefit you could get, even if you manage to qualify, is $432 a month. That's 25% of the poverty line. So I'm just going to leave you with that. I'm going to disappear and sign books, and I think we're going to reconvene in about a half hour. John?
Thank you, Kathy. And yes, we are going to reconvene. I don't know what the weather looks like, but we're set up to have the coffee and the cookies out there in the same spot. If it's good, you can go to the courtyard. If it's not, you can go to the cafeteria. We will reconvene at 10:30. That's 25 minutes at 10:30. And please bring your questions down to the front. Thank you. I think we certainly have hit the nerve chord with this particular inequality lecture today, because the questions came quickly and provocatively, and we've got a lot of material to cover. The first question came from some people in the similar one. How, Kathy, do you manage to stay positive and not feel depressed or discouraged with all the stories you hear and the work you personally observe, or do you sometimes succumb?
Oh boy. Oh, but I've still got my magic. I like rocket fuel and microphone. Well, I have to credit my parents, who not only were just wonderful parents, but also were very engaged in this kind of work themselves. I remember being left my mom was the parish worker at our church, a very poor community, and we were picking up so many kids for Sunday school and youth events that I was once left at church while the van went on without me. I felt very lonely. But they were really trailblazers. When I was 5 years old, they adopted a boy from Ghana, West Africa. You can imagine how this went over in my small Minnesota town. But they were always really doing things to reach out in this way. So it was part of the DNA, I think. But I have to admit, I just love it. I don't know why, but it's life-giving and you know, the sense of gratitude that I was describing earlier, this, if my suffering can make the difference in one person's life, it will have been worth it, is very uniform, I'd say, in my experiences. So people find ways to find joy and gratitude, and it's like inspiring, I think, for those of us who don't have that kind of suffering.
Question having to do with the fact that a lot of these very poor people are single teen moms who, with a high likelihood that the child that they have is going to remain as well a single teen mom in poverty. And the worry expressed is that some of these children will drop out of school, become teen parents themselves, join a gang, commit a crime, and go to jail. Kind of a route that's hard to avoid. Could you comment on that in terms of the obstacles they face?
So I spent about a third of my career researching those exact topics. When I wrote my first book, Making Ends Meet, it was like a media sensation. I did literally hundreds of radio and TV talk shows in a very short period of time. Once I had 3 talk shows in a row, and the last one was at 11:30 at night. It was like midnight talk radio in Chicago. And I remember my husband was just sleeping, and I was just taking it, you know, from our bedroom. But so what people wanted to know, I was telling the story about how you couldn't make ends meet on either welfare or work, but what people really wanted to know is 2 things that I had no answer to, even though I'd spent my 20s with single moms. And the first is, why did they have the kids? And the second was, why don't they get married? So I moved to Camden, New Jersey with my husband and children. And of course, at that time, it was the poorest small city in America and the most violent city in America. It's a great place to raise your kids. And we spent 6 years really talking with hundreds of families about those very issues. I think the family structure issues are real and important, so my books on those topics are promises I can keep, and doing the best I can, one from the mother's point of view and one from the father's point of view. And, you know, complex subjects, but I think one hopeful sign is that teen pregnancy continues to decrease. The average age of first childbirth now for a woman who will ever have a non-marital birth is about 22, right? So it's still an issue. Clearly, the issue of ensuring that every birth is planned and well-timed is still a major issue in our country. And I've written with the Gates Partnership for Mobility from Poverty a policy brief about what I think we ought to do. So if you go to that website, you can get my unvarnished opinions about this topic. But it's important, but it's certainly not the only explanation for the things that we see. And it's as much a response to poverty as it is a cause of poverty. Because when people don't have confidence that their situations will be stable, they don't tend to have the confidence to marry. So again, both a cause and a consequence of the kind of poverty that we see.
To what extent is domestic violence and opioid addiction a key cause of people being unable, well, maybe to enter the poor, but being unable to leave it?
Yeah, so what we know about opioid addiction comes to us from 2 wonderful economists at Princeton, Ann Case and Angus Deaton, who've written about the sharp rise in the deaths of despair. These are deaths from suicide, liver mortality, related causes, and especially opioid overdose. And what's interesting about those data is the growth in these trends is really isolated to one racial and ethnic group and one educational group, and that is white middle educated folks, and particularly men. So this is really a working class white phenomenon. If you follow me into the future, I'm doing some work on that topic. I'm giving the Lee Rainwater lecture at Columbia University in the fall on that topic. but it's fascinating. These deaths of despair are what are almost solely responsible for the fact that for the first time in history, American life expectancy has actually gone down. Now, domestic violence, yes, of course. I've done a lot of work with states and locales trying to help couples learn how to relate to one another in ways that are more conducive to co-parenting. There's evidence that those skills can be taught and people are receptive to them. But it's an issue, and it's one that we often leave to our criminal justice system rather than to intervene with families, sooner and in ways that could be more protective.
Mental health. Is mental health dramatically increased among the poor as a result of their experiences? That mental health problem.
I don't know that, we know that the incidence is much greater. It's really, I think, pretty hard to disentangle whether it's a causal story. So I don't want to overclaim, but if you spend any time in poor communities, it's everywhere. And if you read Tabitha Hicks' story in particular in the book, you will just, it's not as if, there's one trauma. The traumas are compounded in ways that almost seem unbelievable. So in my mind, we're seeing sort of the intergenerational transmission of mental health problems. So parents who didn't get the help they needed, grandparents who didn't get the help they needed. And there was a whole generation in many of our major cities born and coming of age in the 80s and 90s where drugs really did remove a whole generation from functional parenting. So there's also a cohort story, a generational story of what's happened for a certain set of families. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would do a lot of things, but one is really ramp up the provision of mental health services for all of us. I mean, even those of us who are affluent, who have children who've suffered with mental health problems, we know that the services are inadequate.
You and colleagues like Angus Deaton and Ann Case and others, but a small number, have really gotten involved in this problem. But where are our leaders? Are there Black leaders that are talking to African American moms or trying to help the problem or talking to the community? Are there other politicians that you could identify that can bring this to a broader audience than 500 or 600 of us here with an impassioned story of what we need to do to help these people?
Well, it's really interesting. This $2 a day in particular has had huge resonance among lawmakers. I've never met so many members of Congress. It's been fascinating. And in some ways, what $2 a day does is it puts something in someone's hand and says, see, I was right about this. So I felt we were ammunition. Obviously, the election really turned the tide, I think, away from a lot of what could have been achieved. But it's a short time. It's a short-term thing. We were looking over the long span. We have a lot of evidence that Americans are compassionate and care about these issues. So I remain hopeful. But I honestly think that a more important audience than politicians, as much as I think all of you should run for office, it's not too late. We need new voices, is everyday practitioners. So, I've done about, 75 to 100 of these presentations a year over most of my career, one book or another. And the groups I like best are groups like this, groups of nurse home visitors, groups of welfare caseworkers, groups of child support administrators and frontline workers. It is amazing how people who interface with the poor can get really burned out and discouraged and even cynical. And so I think inspiring those audiences to go back and and return to their workplaces re-energized and with a new sense of mission has really been very meaningful. So there are audiences at multiple levels, but all of us can do something, not just those of us who have an elected office.
There were a number of questions, including one from Granite State and one from UVM, who are stitched into this broadcast. And one person here eloquently made it in 4 words, and that is, what can we do? We in this audience.
We in this audience. So I'll tell you a little story. I was about to give a talk to the City Club of Cleveland. If you ever get a chance to attend an event there, I would strongly recommend it. The history of that place and who has spoken there and what speeches have been given there really make one quite intimidated. And as I was on my way to speak to the City Club of Cleveland, I got on the airplane with Sherrod Brown, who's been a major advocate of this book, and he was literally leaning in the aisle, telling me all these stories of the City Club of Cleveland. He's the senator, one of the 2 senators from Ohio, and so I'm in my hotel room about to give this talk, and one of my former PhD students emails me, and he says, I know a lot of people have blogged about $2 a day, but you maybe haven't seen this one. So this young woman named Sarah Dillard, she's got a blog. She was at the Kennedy School when she was one of our few conservative students, which we just treasured, to get that diversity of voices. And she was relating her experience in reading $2 a day and how it just really shook her to the core. And she had gotten together with a group of, she'd been a teacher in TFA, and she'd earlier in her career, prior to going to the Kennedy School, but there was a little reunion group that had gotten together for dinner, and she was telling the story of $2 a day and how much it touched her. And in particular, there's a TFA teacher in the book, Mr. Patton, who rescues Tabitha from this terrible situation with the teacher and does all kinds of other amazing things for the family. And so she began telling about Mr. Patton, because he's a TFA teacher, and then there was a break while the waiter took the order, and the person next to her turned to her and said, I'm Mr. Patton. So, we had to change his name to protect his identity, and she bursts out sobbing. She said, it was not just like a little cry. It was like one of those ragged, out of control, blow your nose kind of, red in the face cries. And she told the table. He was very embarrassed, but he said, you would have done that. And she said, maybe I would have, but I didn't do the first thing. I didn't make a relationship with somebody living in grinding poverty. And so now she has dedicated her career to bridging the gap and bringing together people with means with people without. Now, there's no better way to learn this issue than in the excruciating agony of trying to help just one person. It's not easy. It may never get better, but it'll probably be better than it would have been if you didn't get involved. So that's what I would advise you to do. I'd also advise you to leave bigger tips. It's very practical, right? Go to 25%, but other than tipping. Something you can do, like literally as you walk out of this auditorium, is find a way to forge a relationship. Because if each one of us, forged a relationship with just one person, I think we could see something really dramatic happen, especially in this region.
What businesses other than plasma centers profit from widespread poverty in the United States?
So if you've read the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Eviction, by my colleague at Princeton, Matthew Desmond, you know about some of the exploited investing that goes on in cities. But beyond that, there are no shortage of people that do profit from poverty. For example, the for-profit tax industry was really set up in response to the advent of the Earned Income Tax Credit, the modern version in the early 1990s. I've written extensively about that, In some ways, you can't blame them for taking advantage of a market, right? We give around $90 billion out in tax credits a year now, and yet if you can't file your taxes yourself, or you don't feel confident to buy TurboTax, you're going to go to a for-profit preparer, and they're going to charge you about $200 for the service. So, is that legitimate or not? Well, the government isn't making a way for people to claim that benefit easily. So, but that's one example. I think another example are companies that try to take advantage of the fact that poor communities are flooded with tax credits in early February. Because if you work, this is what I sort of alluded to, this rising inequality within the poor. If you work full-time full year, you get a big income subsidy from the government. So the full-time full year workers are sort of the winners, and then the people who can't do that are sort of the losers. But many companies really target that time of the year. Walmart, a couple of years ago, had a banner on its website saying, February, it's better than Christmas. And indeed, in our book on the EIDC, people were saying that it's better than Christmas. So we want to make sure that businesses deserve to make a profit, but not a usurious profit. So those are just some examples of how poverty is a business.
We've been talking about teen moms or single moms, but there's a guy in there somewhere that got her pregnant, and we haven't talked really about who they are, why in many cases they've left, and whether there's any child support of any nature that flows from that.
Yeah, so my book, Doing the Best I Can, with Tim Nelson, who is here in Hanover, but apparently not here. I think he's checking out your used bookstores, would be my suspicion. He's heard me talk too many times. We've written a book about this topic, and it is really an important one. What we're seeing in the data, I'm also the co-principal investigator of the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Survey, the nation's survey on unmarried and under-resourced families. So this is the survey you would go to if you wanted to find out about these men. One thing that's hopeful and optimistic about this generation of fathers, maybe differently from other generations of fathers, is that fatherhood has become central to this might surprise you. You might say, I don't believe you. Fatherhood, it's everywhere in the data. Fatherhood has become central to men's identities, maybe even superseding work. And not just sort of bringing home the bacon, but the idea that you play a crucial role in the nurturing and the care and the love of your child, and that you are an essential mentor and guide. So the ideology that men are operating under is really different from their fathers. They really see themselves almost like mothers in their role. But the problem is they're much less likely to be married to the mothers. They're much less likely to have had stable relationship with the mothers prior to conception. And the mothers end up being the gatekeepers. So it's actually, on the one hand, an optimistic story about the culture of masculinity really changing to incorporate these generative roles, but also sort of a glass half empty in that they're much less able, given their circumstances, of the larger circumstances of family structure, to enact those goals. And what we show in Doing the Best I Can is that they end up satisfying this fatherhood desire through serial selective fatherhood, where they have fathers across households and selectively invest. Now, this is not the outcome one would think was ideal, and it's not ideal to the men either. So we need to find ways to connect men with kids that are both meaningful to fathers and conducive to child well-being. Currently, if you're an unmarried dad, in most states in the United States, you have no automatic rights to see your child, even if you're paying child support. Absolutely none. Child support is crucial, but you essentially face taxation without representation, and that is true in both of the states within the region we're talking about here. So we've treated these men like paychecks rather than parents, and that needs to change. And again, if you go on the Gates Foundation website for the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, we've been working with child support directors and advocates all over the country to figure out how to transform this crucial institution, child support, into a truly family-building institution. I think we've got some really amazing ideas. And folks in New England have been really involved in thinking about creative solutions. So I commend that to you, and hope you can advocate. Child support is my big thing right now. It literally, if you're a poor household and you get child support, any child support, it's 50% of your income. If you get the full amount owed, and you're a poor single mom, it's 67% of your income. More money flows to poor children through child support than any other source. And yet, the system is falling apart. Fewer and fewer people are walking through its doors. So it's a time that's ripe for intervention and for advocacy. Some of you have asked me while we were signing books about advocacy. So advocating for really turning child support around, I think, is a good way to expend your energies.
What are the most impactful charitable organizations that serve the poor in America that we might get involved with or even support in other ways financially? Are there any?
Yeah, so there are a lot of really amazing charities. It's been really fun doing this tour of America over the last 3.5 years, 3 years now with $2 a Day came out 3 years ago next month. And just let me give you a few examples. Falmouth, Massachusetts has a multi-center, multi-service food pantry. It incorporates about 400 community volunteers, 405, I believe. They operate year-round, so many of the volunteers are winter folk, and that's what a lot of the poor folk stay around in the winter, right? But they have no income. And they have all of these very innovative things that they do to make sure people feel valued and incorporated. One, they offer volunteer opportunities. How simple is that, right? Like, how can I get involved? Just because I'm a client doesn't mean I can't be a volunteer as well. Second, they allow you to choose your food. You don't just get the bag with the lima beans that your kids aren't going to eat, right? Or the canned spinach. Although I realize they're very in vogue again right now among us, older eaters. But you actually get to choose your food in accordance with your family's needs. The families are partnering with the organization to transform their community. And another example is a food pantry in Plano, Texas, run by 4 women who used to be on food stamps. They're now middle-class Black women living in Plano, which is not the poorest part of Texas, let me just say. And because they felt the stigma and shame so keenly in their own experiences, when they open the doors of this food pantry, they roll out a red carpet. And then they line this red carpet and they sing and dance a welcome song as people walk down the aisle. Now, this may sound trivial, but we spent 400 years in America operating under the assumption that the only way to alleviate poverty is to make it as miserable and as shameful as possible. And that is an untested proposition. And in fact, social psychological research suggests the opposite, that if you affirm people and you make them feel valued and enhance their sense of belonging, they're actually more likely to engage in the kind of activities that lead to mobility from poverty. It actually affects their brain function. It improves working memory. On the other hand, if you exclude somebody, it has the same effect on the body as if you punch somebody in the gut. Read Tabitha's story. The exclusion she experiences on a daily basis is just overwhelming. So we're literally corroding people's physiology. We're their bodies are crumbling under the weight of social rejection. I don't know where I was going with this story. What was the question?
Go on to the next.
Okay, you get the idea. So dignity is really important, is what I'm saying, and we're putting it to the test in the lab to see if we can convince you all that how you give is important, not just if you give.
Has this problem been successfully addressed and maybe partly solved in other countries that maybe could serve as an example for our country to emulate and follow?
You know, it's really hard to do this because there are so many differences between our country and other countries. My friend right here, we were talking before the session began, he was just talking about how big, just the physical size of the U.S. poses challenges. Of course, our deep sin of race and racism makes poverty alleviation a huge challenge here that other countries don't face to nearly the same degree. I was just at the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. Our country's economy was really predicated on slavery. It is really powerful. It's a very powerful exhibit along with the new museum in Washington, D.C. But now I'm forgetting again.
Other countries.
Other countries. Yeah, so, you know, you could hold up the idea of flex security from European countries taking, I believe this idea emerged maybe in Denmark. The idea that you take your benefits with you, your benefits sort of sit above the jobs you might move between. That's a creative idea. In Norway, where I spent a week this fall, you know, you free childcare from birth, really, a high quality childcare. Everybody participates in the public system. But there are many countries that do, you know, the kind of poverty we are describing here really doesn't exist in the rest of the industrialized rich world. The kind of family structure breakdowns that we see, the instability in the family, also doesn't exist in the rest of the rich world. Maybe the two are correlated. Unintended pregnancy, it just doesn't happen in much of the rich world. Why are 50% of our pregnancies unintentional? Maybe there's a correlation there. So I don't know that we can emulate Europe because we're so different, not only in our demography, but also in our ethos and what it means to be an American. So maybe we need to find our own solutions, but there are certainly lessons we can borrow from across the rich world.
For a moment, I want to switch to a different emphasis on inequality, a broader emphasis on inequality than strictly on the poor, which you so eloquently cover. Several people have read an article in the June issue of Atlantic, because they are quoting numbers here, that talked about the inequality that exists in America and is getting worse. The article does not apparently isolate the upper 1%. It says that the upper 0.1% account for 22% of America's wealth. And the next 9.9% is 60% of America's wealth. So 10% account for 82% of our wealth. The other 90% are accounting for only 18% of the wealth. And it's a way, could you comment on this broad inequality that exists from the top to the bottom?
So this may sound unbelievable, but it's actually pretty hard to study the effects of inequality per se on X outcome. It's an empirical challenge because we have to essentially compare across nations in order to do that empirical work. We don't have that many rich nations, and they're all so different from one another. We do have some evidence that inequality per se of the kind that you're describing is bad for outcome X, especially voting. But it's harder than you would think to actually document that story. Here's what I can say with confidence about inequality. First of all, inequality is manifest in our residential patterns, in the institutions that we take advantage of. Today in the United States, we have never in our entire history been as residentially segregated by income as we are right now. Even within groups, African Americans, Asians, we have unprecedented rates of residential segregation. So the Asian rich are segregated from the Asian poor. The black rich are segregated from the African American poor, and whites, and so on. Whites are the least segregated, by the way. But we've never been more segregated. So our ability to empathize and understand or even see is sharply limited because of our daily routines. This is magnified in the institutions we attend, the schools our children go to, the churches, synagogues, and mosques we find ourselves in. In all of these venues, we have never been as segregated. And that's partly almost an automatic result of rising inequality more generally. But the second, I think, more worrying set of findings comes from the work of Raj Chetty, Nathan Hendren, and Larry Katz, all from Harvard, who are also part of the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, who show with damning evidence drawn now from these historical IRS data, that one zip code really does determine one's destiny. Looking at intergenerational mobility, the story is really, really damning. This segregation is killing the mobility, particularly of African American boys, but other groups as well. So we are becoming, this is like the opposite of our ethos as a people, right? This is the opposite of the ethos of how this country was formed in the first place. So those are things to definitely be worried about. Segregation is perhaps among, along with climate change and poverty more generally, perhaps the third great evil of our time, if I had to pick three.
Are we trading rights for privileges? The right to a good education, the right to good health care, which many don't have, but those in the upper levels of the society certainly get a good education if they want, and they certainly get good health care because they can afford it. So are we in the process of more and more trading rights for privileges, and that helps only a small number of Americans?
Yeah, that's a great question. So David Grusky, who's the head of the Stanford Center on Inequality, says, we've commodified opportunity in America. You have to buy opportunity in America, right? You have to buy a good school. You have to buy a good hospital. So just to give you one example, again from the Delta, because I was just there. So the Sunflower schools, this is a little Delta town of about 2,000 people, have had a hard time attracting teachers. They have very few certified teachers in their schools. Many of the teachers that have been certified have been certified through Teach for America. They also don't want to spend a lot of money on their schools. And so they've resorted to putting their kids into online curriculum for many of their classes. The average student now, according to the report I received when I was there last week, will go through the entire school day seeing only one teacher, having only one subject with an actual teacher. Not only that, the online curriculum are completely untested and don't work. And to make matters worse, the school doesn't have that many computers. So a lot of times kids are just waiting around for a machine. This is public education in Sunflower, Mississippi. Now let's say you get sick in Sunflower, Mississippi. Your closest hospital is Clarksdale. Last time I checked, that was a D-rated hospital. If you live in neighboring Alligator and something happens to you, there's no ambulance service in the county that Alligator sits in. So you literally have to drive your loved one to the county line for an ambulance to come pick them up, take them to the local hospital. In basic infrastructure that we have all taken for granted if we live in rich states is lacking in many parts of the nation. So we've commodified inequality, right? We've put equality on the auction block, and that has, you know, if you believe that that's a good idea, and you know, then you've really got to think about ensuring that everybody who wants to work can get a job. Right? It becomes much more. It's much more on the economy to provide the kind of resources that allow people to participate in that commodification. If you've got a system like that.
Another element of this 9.9%, and by the way, to qualify, you say that if you have a net worth of 1.2 million, a net worth, that includes your house and includes everything else, investments, then you're in the 9.9 already. But one of the things is the fact that these people can afford private education, colleges. A statistic is Princeton, your own school, 28% of the students are from private schools. Harvard, 27% from private schools. Now we can get into, and I'd like to ask you about, obviously, applicants and affirmative action and so forth, but is it working? It seems like, again, the
social reproduction, right?
Yeah.
You know, I didn't go to an elite institution myself until graduate school, but having been part of them, it's amazing to me. Like, what did your father do? I remember right on the eve of the recession, I had a young student in my class who was really into homelessness, just this delightful guy. And, you know, I said, it was gosh, what month would it have been? It was the month that everything collapsed, and anyway, it turned out his father was the managing partner of one of the big banks that literally fell the day that we had the conversation about his passion for the homeless. So that was a whole new world to me, just, you know, as a kid from rural Minnesota. But most of our institutions are engaged in social reproduction. At Princeton, we've made it an explicit criteria to honor our Pell-eligible students and to consider economic background in admissions decisions. As a consequence, we now have 23% of our students who are Pell-eligible all of a sudden. And these kids in our classrooms, so one of our students who's working for me this summer, her family, you know, she grew up in a shack in rural Kentucky. When it rained, one whole wall was like a waterfall. You know, the family income of $15,000 a year the year she applied to Princeton. So you could imagine what's happening. You know, it's not always comfortable, but there's enough of these students where they're proud of their origins, and they say, "Oh, I'm from a poor background," not like I'm from a poor background. I mean, we literally went from 4% to 21 or 23% in just a couple of years. So I'm enjoying watching these young people shake up the notions of what kind of knowledge counts in the classroom. And of course, these poor kids know a lot of things that the rich kids don't know.
The middle class in America, many have felt that they've been left behind. There's resentment.
Yeah.
They feel it's unfair. There's a lot of fingers pointed. Our president obviously tapped into this group with his message. And most are non-college educated, so it's hard for them to improve. Even with our president's sexual comments and so forth, he attracted, of women who did not go to college, he attracted 52% of that group to vote for him. Could you comment on this, people left behind, and the feelings they have, and what their aspirations are, and whether this is a growing feeling?
So this is the first generation of young people, the young people coming of age right now, who are unlikely to do better than their parents. Huge challenge to the American narrative. If you talk to people, as the General Social Survey does, about whether they think how they rate their prospects in comparison to their parents, you see a sharp decline among whites.
Blacks and Hispanics are still hopeful that they'll do a little bit better. Hispanics not quite as hopeful as African Americans, but among whites in particular. Not only do they factually face lower life chances, but they perceive that their chances are lower than those of their parents. So this is a huge issue. Can we figure out a way, and at the same time, they've really withdrawn from traditional family structure, especially these whites. Right, they're much less likely to get married before the first child. They're much less likely to attend any kind of religious service. There was no class difference in religious attendance between sort of these working class and middle class whites in the 70s, and this gap has just grown fairly dramatically over the last 4 decades. So what we're seeing among this group is not just a sort of a withdrawal from work, right? We know the work participation rate for prime age workers, both men and women, is falling among men to unprecedented levels, unprecedented low levels. They're withdrawing from work, they're withdrawing from traditional family forms, and they're withdrawing from faith communities. So it's they're living deinstitutionalized lives in a way that I don't think we have any parallel for. Now, there's good reasons why they might have withdrawn, right? Your dad worked at the Ford plant, you're working at the Quickie Mart, and you're only getting 25 hours a week. Well, awfully hard to marry the girl of your dreams on that salary, right? And a lot of people have been soured. I am a person of faith and I attend church, but I have to admit, there's reasons why you might not go to church right now. If you're either Catholic, Protestant, or any other kind of religion. So maybe we need to rethink and remake these relationships in fundamentally different ways. But right now, I don't think we have a path forward for a very large number of Americans. The majority of Americans.
So many of these economic justice and social justice issues are intertwined. We have a session next week on immigration, but there are a couple of questions regarding this broad middle class, saying, is part of the problem that they feel that immigrants are cutting in line?
So that's the hypothesis of Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in Our Land. But I just want to caution you against sort of accepting that narrative. That book is written about activists in the Tea Party movement. And she's an impeccable sociologist from Berkeley. I believe the story for that group of people, but we've got students all over the country, in coal country and so on, who are not expressing those racial resentments. And what's interesting is that the work of Mike Hout, who is a colleague of Arlie Hochschild at Berkeley, has recently demonstrated that among all Americans, anti-immigrant animus and racial animus has declined. But it's declined faster among the college-educated than everybody else. So I think this is a hugely oversold story. Michael Hout has just moved to NYU, will be publishing these results soon, but when you look at the voting patterns across our nation in those areas that you think of Trump country, such as coal country, and if you voted for Trump, I'm glad you're here. So I don't mean to be partisan here. Most people in those counties didn't vote for anyone. Maybe the real story is why people are so politically disengaged. So take these media narratives with a grain of salt, or at least, there are a lot of rural folk around here. I'm sure there's a complex story that you yourself can investigate.
Could there be a renewal of programs from the federal government that invite people to work in exchange for gaining monetary benefits elsewhere?
So right now, just one other little nuance on our cash welfare system, TANF. The federal government still sends $16 billion to states every year for their programs. But states have now siphoned off all but about $5 billion, and they've spent it for other purposes, everything from college scholarships to crisis pregnancy centers to child care vouchers. And they've done that because the block grants were very, very poorly constructed and not monitored. So we, right now, welfare reform is supposed to put people to work. That was a pretty bipartisan goal, right? And welfare recipients themselves wanted to work. So, but we only spend 8% of our TANF dollars on anything related to work. So people have virtually no help on getting work. So there are a variety of policy options out there. Guaranteeing minimum income, in my view, that's not consistent with the American ethos, but I may be wrong. When I was down in the Delta, I was sort of thinking, man, that doesn't sound so bad, because it is a world without work, or there just really are no jobs. Guaranteed jobs is another popular idea out there, but our government has never been very good at doing that kind of thing. So how would we really implement guaranteed jobs? Jobs on demand. I think those are really interesting ideas. I would like to see some pilot studies. But again, we would really have to ramp up a set of capacities we've never been able to build as a government. What we advocate for in $2 a day is public-private partnerships, where we really work with people who know how to get people to work, i.e., the private sector, and we try to figure out ways of partnering in ways that benefit both workers and employees. But we also advocate, because even if we do that, we're not going to have enough jobs. Now you're going to say to me, well, the unemployment rate is at a historic low. Yes, but the unemployment rate does not account for discouraged workers or involuntarily part-time workers. It is not reflective of who wants to work in the country anymore. And we're probably going to need to invest in public sector jobs that the market will not provide. We have too many dirty streets. We have schools with too few teachers. We have parks without any rangers. Our national park system is without adequate staffing to stay open for all of the hours that those of us who hike and camp and canoe would like to use them. There's so much that needs to be done in our communities that simply isn't getting done. And a bold effort, infrastructure is another example. So can we put America to work in a WPA style fashion? I think that's a promising approach. But again, I think we need to think about public-private partnerships.
When you drive around this upper valley, which we live in, and you go, let's say, to Lebanon or West Lebanon, right near here, it seems like every single company, every single fast food restaurant, has a sign out saying, we're looking for jobs. We have jobs available, we're hiring, and on and on. And it seems like if that's true, granted, some might be part-time, but doesn't that represent opportunity for some of the poor people in the area?
Yeah, what's really interesting is just the conundrum of why it is that employers don't offer full-time hours. And I think there's really good reasons that they do so. And one no-brainer would be to figure out what aspects of our policy are really motivating employers to eschew full-time employment for their workers. We all know what the incentives are, but certainly there are ways of fixing that. So employers have a greater incentive to hire people full-time. But I think more fundamentally, so I always have employers in the audience, and I'm always so glad that they're there, because often they'll say, I'm running a plant, I have $11 jobs, I'm down in X county, and I can't get qualified workers. And often we can intervene with them and say, well, actually, you got a pool of workers 12 miles away, there's no transportation between where these workers are, where your plant is. And by the way, you might have to, forgo the felony conviction restriction, or you might have to think again about hiring returning citizens. Hopkins Hospital did this. They actually made a push of hiring returning citizens, and it's just amazing how successful the program has been. So you might have to change your tax. You might have to think about the drug test. But you could oftentimes with a little bit of finessing you can solve the problem. Generally, though, it's a transportation issue. So why can't we work together as regions to solve these issues? If I were to do one thing in many of our regions to solve the problem of poverty, I would tell a nonprofit to get a van and begin driving people to work.
One final question. Is it possible that the lack of funding or interest among our government officials in providing funding is due to our reluctance to admit the problem of poverty?
I actually think we're beyond denial. Most of us know something's wrong. I think we've been focusing on the top 1%, which is legitimate. We've been focusing on what's happening, with the white working class, which is completely legitimate. But I think the plight of the white working class is really a siren, or what do you call that? A canary in the coal mine? I'm like losing my metaphors. A canary in the coal mine, right? And so I'm optimistic that people are starting to care, and I'm pretty sure people have to care because we can't keep going on like this, right? It's inefficient. It's maybe morally wrong, but it's also inefficient. And it will end up crippling our country. You get someone like Ray McCormick, who's living in this. You've got to read Ray's story. Oh my gosh, how does this woman hold on to a job? Many of your workers may not be showing up at your workplace because their lives are falling apart, because they're living in their cars. Right? We can't go on like this. We can't actually function as a country. So I'm confident that even if moral arguments don't work, which I hope they will, that efficiency arguments will.
Kathy, you have vividly and compellingly told the story from the vantage point of the poor, who I know you're so committed to. And I think we all want to thank you for a wonderful, wonderful presentation.